Now that we have gotten familiar with Linux, let's learn Docker together. We're going to follow the instructions on the official Docker page on how to install it. So let's just get it done. So the first thing we want to do is issue sudo update. Now, as you can see, we're not using the root account, so we need to escalate our privileges using the sudo command. The next step, let's just copy paste the text from the page. Excellent. Let's make a directory for the keys. Then let's download the keys. Now let's do an echo command. Okay, the next command is just copy it. Yes, we want to continue. Okay. Now it's time to pick the version of the Docker we want. In this case, we're going to select the version on top. So let's copy the second column. And again, we're going to replace this part with the version we want. And that's 5, semicolon 20, 10, 17, tilde, 3-8, tilde, Ubuntu, Jammy. Let's press enter. Awesome. Now let's verify that the Docker is running, and we do so with this command. So installation seems to be successful. So now we can get going with Docker. So what exactly is Docker? It's a piece of software and it's a type of virtualization that allows us to run our applications in a container. Running an application in container means the container only uses what it needs, therefore being very light on resources and being very portable because you can quickly move it to another system without experiencing any issues. Now let's create our first app. It won't quite be an app, it'll be something very simple, but at least it'll tell us how Docker works and how to create containers. Let's create a directory called first app. And we do so in our home directory. So let's just make sure we're in the home directory. Let's just verify the folder has been created. Perfect. Let's cd into the directory we just created. Now let's create another directory called src. Let's just make sure it's there. Perfect. Inside the src directory, let's create a file. Let's call the file index.php. Now let's edit that index.php file. And we're going to write echo. And we're just going to write first app. And we want to save the file. Now let's go back into the first app directory and create a file called Dockerfile. And now let's edit the Docker file. So let's try to understand what Dockerfile is. But before we tell you what Dockerfile is, basically we need to know what Docker image is. It's a read-only file with a bunch of instructions. When these instructions are executed, it creates a Docker container based on that image. Now the Docker file is just a simple text file that gives Docker instructions to build the Docker image. Now the great thing about Docker, it has a Docker hub, which has many images to choose from for whatever our programming needs are. So we'll head off to the hub, Docker hub, and we're going to look for PHP. Now you can see there is an official Docker image of PHP. So let's click into it. Now we have to pick basically an image of PHP, which has all the PHP libraries, everything that's needed to run a PHP. And let's have a look at which ones are available by clicking here. Now let's scroll down the list and let's look for one with Apache, because we need an Apache web server. And you can see there's a lot of alphas, so we want to stay clear of the alphas and look for the stable release. And we can see it here. We're going to use this one. So let's edit our Docker file by typing in from, and we're going to type in PHP semicolon, and we're going to type in the name of the package we located early that we want to pick from. In this case, it's 8.18 Apache Bullseye. The next thing we want to do, we want to copy the content of src folder we created. Remember, that's the folder that contains index.php file, and we want to place it in this location on this image. And now this location here is the default directory of Apache web server. On the next line, we want this image to listen on port 80, and that's the default port that Apache web server receives incoming traffic into. Now let's save this file and let's try to build an image. Now that we're in a first app folder, let's have a look at the content. So we have a Docker file and we have src folder which contains our PHP file. And our PHP file just echoes first app. Now let's run the container and let's build an image. To build an image, we type in docker build -t, and we want to call this just an app, and then we have to put a dot to tell it the location of what it's building, where it's located. Okay, so it looks like we have to run sudo. Now what it's doing, it's getting the image file that we specified in the configuration file, docker first, and it's getting the PHP and Apache. Now this might take a little bit of time, but we'll get there. And as you can see, the second step, it copied the contents of the directory src, where our file is located, and it copied it into this directory. Now this directory doesn't exist on our system, it only exists on this Docker container. Now let's run the image we created, and in turn it's going to create a container for us. Now p command tells us to forward the request coming to localhost onto the container, which is the port 80. We call it app. Apologies for permissions. And as you can see, our container is now running. Now let's check that we can now access the Apache server on our local host. And as you can see, it's showing us first app. Congratulations, you have managed to create an app that runs in a Docker. Now let's see what happens when we change. When we change the see what happens when we change the index.php file. Now let's edit the text. Call it second app. Now let's go back to our local host and refresh it. And as you can see, it doesn't change. Now that's because when Docker creates an image file, it's pretty much a very static image file, and it doesn't get updated. Now if we wanted to permanently link, and by the way, if you ever terminate the container, you will see that it all breaks. Now let's run the image, but make sure it constantly gets updated as we make the changes to the app. And we can do so by typing in the following command. Docker run p. We want it to forward the port requests, -v, and then we type in the whole complete path to our source folder. And then what we want to do, we want to connect it to HTML folder. And apologies, I forgot the permissions again. To run it as sudo. Now let's have a look at the local host and see what happens. And you can see now it's running. Now let's see what happens when we try to update this. Second app, edited. Now let's refresh it. And you can see it's constantly being updated.